and welcome to this session on risk management. I just wanted to update this one to keep it in line with current things that are happening, but also to think about safety management systems and how they are used in the risk management process as part of Module 3 within the Level 7 apprenticeship. So without further ado, just want to give you an overview of some of the aims of this session. So thinking about how it links safety management systems to, well, you could ask the question, why do we have them? And, you know, controlling loss so that you can consider the worst case scenario when things do go wrong. How we can then manage those risks to avoid major incidents and potential disasters. How we can then build within our systems, typically an integrated management system, some kind of SHE-Q, should we say, approach: safety, health, environment, and quality. And all that needs to come together as a management process. But within it, you've got to start with your principles. How far are we going to go down the route of quality, should we say, to be able to say, this is where we are now, this is where we want to be, this is how we're going to get there, how far are we going to go into this route? Some companies like have a cottage industry of health, safety, environment, and quality to make sure that all aspects of risk to the business are fully considered. And that's the way it is. You know, the safety management system rules the roost, and that's the way they work. But think about what's out there to assist us in terms of how we can do it. The simplest way is HSG 65, as it used to be called, Successful Health and Safety Management. But then you can also go down the route of the BS and ISO auditing approach, where you can set standards that are internationally recognized. And then it comes down to how you interpret each of the clauses within the standards to then say, well, that's how it best suits our particular company and our way of working and our culture. And so it's building the system that works best for each individual company without it perhaps being a cottage industry. But like I said, there are a few companies out there that have to follow the procedure. It's been written that way. It's in line with the policy. The system dictates how things are done. And then ultimately the culture and the way of being is dictated and becomes part of the system, the procedure, the management process. So it can be flexible in its approach, but like I say, each individual company that puts in a risk and safety management system end up with their own interpretation of how they meet each of those clauses and various standards. The management system needs to cover all issues regarding health and safety, all hazards and all risks that are posed to the company. So let's say you've got dust. Let's say it's maybe it's a flower dust, and in your company that's a big issue. And in order to control that risk, there's an aspect of DSEA regulations, so dangerous substances, explosive atmosphere regulations would apply. But that is not always the case for every company in every industry. Therefore, you only look at the hazards and the risks that are posed to your organization. Think about occupational health conditions and then related conditions as well, in terms of how they can affect people and their way of life. Again, pulls back to the health, the hazard risks that were posed and discussed earlier. So you might have, under COSH, for example, you might have that flower dust again, and then rather thinking of the explosion risk, now you start talking about the occupational asthma results of being exposed to the flower dust. I should put in there all applicable legislation, because some companies would say, well, we can't, and we don't intend to cover all aspects of legislation, but what we'll do is cover all legislation that is applicable to us. And then what's the industry standard? What's the interpretation of that? Because again, when you come to defining what your approach to manage that particular risk and writing it into the safety management system, it's got to be a standard that's comparable within the industry. So a benchmarking approach. And then proactive and reactive monitoring measures. So how best can you utilize that, and how far are you going down the check route in terms of monitoring to say, well, look at those examples. You could just monitor your risks by a reactive measure, whereby you've had no accidents or limited number of accidents in the field. However, you might have lots of people suffering with ill health conditions. So from your reactive assessments of people's health, you find that you're getting complaints, you send them off to a occupational health specialist, and it comes back the extent and degree of the condition and how many people are suffering from it, and therefore are we adequately controlling our risks in terms of our, once we identified it through our monitoring systems, how then are we going to do something about it. And this is important when it comes to the management review meeting, which is the starter point every year, to be able to say, these are the goals, these are the objectives, this is where we're going with this, to get commitment from your senior management team, the resources, and also the budget to be able to do what you need to do to manage all your risks effectively without going overboard. So what I'm saying is all of that, it becomes your policy statement, but also your responsibilities, and then further from that becomes your manual, your health and safety manual, and your environmental manual, and your quality manual. How are we going to do these things? How far are we going to go down that route of gaining that support? So I wanted at this point to show you an example of this in terms of my file that I have with one of my clients. So down the where you've got the yellow folders there, that literally is taken out of my computer to show you the in one client's area, all the subject area they build into the integrated management system. You could look at that and you could argue that in some cases it's bigger than you might yourself have to manage, and in other cases it could be smaller. For example, contractors and the management of contractors. Well, there's a procedure on the right-hand side that says about sales and contracts, and that will include an aspect of management of contractors when they come on site, perhaps the induction program they have to go through. It could talk about the vetting procedure that you go through and tendering procedure that you go through before you decide on who is adequately competent to be able to do the work you want to do with them or employ them to do. So you could just basically have a system that says we'll send out and ask people to tender for, but we won't go into too much detail. Or you might have a really detailed system that has a file on control of contractors in it, and within that you've set a procedure out that explains specifically how we manage and vet and identify competence of contractors, look at the insurance cover that they may have, and so on and so forth. So you'll get different files for different companies for the different integrated management system that applies to, as was said in the previous slide, the amount of hazards and risks that they are themselves posed with. In kind of the middle at the bottom of that slide there, you'll see just 5 examples of policies that are in place there. So we've got the IMS policy, and within that is the health, safety, environment policy as well, qualities policy statement, and also, just to throw in a couple of extras, modern slavery. And again, some companies do a risk register, and from the risk register they might say, oh, we're not doing enough in one particular area, and therefore we might need to do more and have a procedure or a policy on that. On the right-hand side, you can see 10 examples of procedures. Some have got the same detail or the same title, but it's applicable to the head office, to one of the sub-offices, and to another sub-office. So I've just protected the names there by not putting in. And therefore, again, some companies might have as little as 6 or 7 procedures in order to comply with the ISO management system. Or it could be a lot more than that, based on how far they want to dig into each one. So just to give you an example of that, let's look at the purchasing supplier approval. We mentioned before about contractors. Some companies have a procedure for the management of contractors. So within that purchasing supplier, there's one tiny bit about contractors, and again, sales and contracts has a tiny bit about management of contractors, but nevertheless, it covers the clause in the ISO standards. So, yeah, like I say, some procedures are quite detailed and you've got a longer list dependent on how far, whether it's a cottage industry where you live and breathe quality, health, safety, and environment, or whether it literally is, I need the badge of the ISO badge because it's going to help me to get more contracts. And as a result of that, they can see that we have a quality system like ISO 9001. Once we've got ISO 9001, we're going to have the documentation in place, the records and legislation compliance are going to be considered. We're going to build a risk register. And so it will go on till eventually all of those policies, procedures, risk assessments, cost assessments, and variety of different monitoring aspects cover the full cycle of what's expected within quality management, and then the specifics of health, safety, and environment. So one of the key issues I must address is the fact that, and we did say this earlier, it's said in the list all legislation. Well, it has to take account of the applicable legislation, and therefore some companies might not have to cover, say, 95 pieces of legislation. They might only have to cover 60 because that's all that applies to them. So one of them, for example, is noise. You might not work in a noisy environment, so you can forget to some degree the noise regulations, other than perhaps doing a quick assessment to do a noise or acoustic level check. And as a result of that, you find it below the action levels, take no further action. So from that point of view, you can put it to one side and not build it into your risk register. Whereas in other bigger industries, manufacturing, construction, etc., it's a big part of what they do and the potential risks, excuse me, that people are exposed to. So it comes down to the person that does the auditing, the ISO expert, to go in and interpret the various clauses in the ISO standards in order to then define a safety management system that best suits that individual company, and within it, looking at the various different pieces of legislation and say, does that apply, does that apply, does that apply? If it does, go into sufficient detail around it and make sure that all aspects of the legislation are covered. So rather than just putting the management of health and safety at work regulations there, I've then put a little subheading that says safety management principles, because that regulation itself is one of our biggest and most credible pieces around safety management. So it sets out the principle of risk profiling, risk control, risk assessment, competent support, occupational health, etc., etc. So it's a huge piece. And therefore, I would say every safety management system has to have a link to the management regulations, and the auditor needs to have sufficient knowledge and understanding of the various aspects of the Management Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999. But from then on, the other bits of legislation really does pick and place. You could argue that pure is provision use of working regulations, probably applicable to all companies. Some might have a little bit of COSH, hazardous substances, and they only do a little bit of work on that area. Others are totally dependent on it because of the type of hazards they have and the substances they use or produce in the workplace, and therefore it's a big thing. So again, the variation on this literally is the competent person, the advisor, needs to be able to understand the typical requirements of each piece of legislation, look at the applicability to that company, and then make sure that appropriate advice is given. So that then, as you saw earlier, I had a file on COSH assessments because in that company's example, hazardous substances were a big thing. So it's a big part of the management system. You can end up with a legal compliance register, whether it's, I've just pulled out the health and safety one first. So the ones beginning with H, we'll put in, and you can see now how, when I've said what legislation is applicable, wherever that is applicable to any company, then each piece of legislation comes part of the legal compliance register, and then you can throw links in within it and then look at the variety of different aspects of that legislation so that there is an understanding and people can read further if they wish to. But if you can imagine, a competent person comes in, talks about it, but the manager, the line manager, the supervisor that's actually implementing this, they might want to go and check it themselves. So what we do in our register is make that link so that you can go to the HSE website or wherever to then download a copy of the applicable legislation. The one on the left there was the environmental standards. And again, there's only 4 that are in there, but for some companies, there could be as many as 20 different pieces of legislation you have to consider in order to comply with it. It becomes part of the bigger list of the legal compliance register. Similarly, the risk register, what you're saying with your risk register is there anything in our world of working that could be significant and therefore have a large impact on us? So rather than me just saying this is limited to health and safety, it is not. It's quality, it's safety, it's health, it's environment, but more specifically, it's risks to the business. So it could be the way of working, it could be finance, it could be cash flow, it could be the political environment, it could be COVID, as you see there's 113 there as an example, and the impact that they have on the different parts of the organization or indeed the way of working. So the risk register gives us an opportunity to look at what's in place, how much of that is a risk, do a risk rating on it, what have we got in place in terms of current controls, and perhaps what further do we need to then make sure that we've covered all our angles. Again, if you think about this, it becomes something that's part of your management review meeting at the beginning of each year, but also perhaps you need quarterly management review meetings to make sure that the objectives that you set, the goals that you set, the risk register you've got in place are still up to date, or there's been new changes or new significant risks that are now impacting the way the company works. Another big thing within that is people involved in the business need to be competent in what they do and how they do things. So again, as part of the plan, do, check, act process, the check bit should include competency checks, whether it's machine operators, as is the case in this one, or it could be transfer of waste, and people need to know competencies around that. It could be induction processes at the beginning of a new starter, all the way through to, let's say, a forklift truck driver who needs to have 3 forms of competency checks done, get your license to be able to drive a forklift truck, get your training to be able to do your specifics around your job, and then get further training on that piece of forklift truck that you actually use on a day-to-day basis. Maybe you've got to take the forks off and put a spike on because you're going to lift a bale. Whatever it might be, you do some kind of training needs analysis. And think about refinery areas or big industries where the risk levels are high, nuclear and the likes of. This competency list that's been provided in front of us might be huge, but ultimately you're going to say, in order to control or mitigate loss or prevent accidents and incidents and disasters from happening within the workplace, we've looked at the training needs of individuals, matched it to their job role, and made sure that all areas are adequately covered. So typically when I'm doing this in simple and medium to low risk environments, it might be fire warden training, it might be first aid training, it might be a little bit on work equipment training and so on. But in the high risk environments, it's much more than that. It's, you know, teams of people trained against awarding body standards to be able to work in their field as specialists. You know, so you're going to put them through accredited training where you've got certificates and licenses against each and every aspect of what they do. And then you're going to then say, well, if this became an emergency situation, we need to be able to react effectively. And therefore we need competent people to be able to do that. And that might be, rather than having fire wardens, you might have a team of, or even a fire team on site that would look at, well, if we have a minor explosion or a minor fire, it could turn into a major explosion that could be disastrous to the company. So we want a team of people that can react in that emergency and diffuse the situation well before the fire rescue service turn up. So again, there's a lot more involved in the higher risk industries and environments. So just a consideration, perhaps you might think about one aspect, and it was in my list previously. What about occupational health? Yes, it's in the management regulations. It's also in cost regulations and several other modern pieces of legislation, noise, for example. The key issue is if you've done risk assessments and if you've identified that there is a significant risk, it should be part of the process to then say, well, how bad is this risk impacting on our staff, our employees, and others that might be in and around that particular area, causing that potential ill health condition? And therefore, as a result of that, we measure it. How do we measure it? Perhaps we have to send them off to occupational health nurses, perhaps we have to send them to a doctor. There may be even a team of people that come in and provide that service for you as part of a competency program. It's all very dependent on the customers and the different types of business. But it starts with, as we have with other areas, let's set our goals in place first of all. It's part of our aims and objectives. It may well be, well, we need a policy really, because we need to identify that if somebody's alcohol dependent, for example, and we have an incident at work whereby alcohol could have been a contributory factor towards that incident or accident, what action are we going to take there? Are we going to be a welfare kind of supportive company that will take account of the occupational health side of things, or are we going to have a zero tolerance whereby, because of the level of danger and the work that they were doing, we can't possibly allow someone to be under the influence, and therefore it's gross misconduct and out they go. So there needs to be a policy in place first of all that says this is our mission and this is how we're going to manage that. Within the management of it, you then say, well, what procedures will we have in place, and also what documentation is necessary. And then you've got to think about patient disclosure and a recording and holding of information that might be a little bit questionable, and therefore data protection and so on might come in as well. So think about the procedure and what's written within it, and then think about how you're going to monitor and check and look at compliance within it. So that was just one example there, but it could apply to many other areas. So health and safety management and the safety management systems are based around a few pieces of standards, should we say. The HSG, so Health and Safety Guidance Document 65, it used to be actually titled Successful Health and Safety Management. So they had in the first version of it, before it was revised in 2013, examples from companies where they've implemented a safety management system and it's successful, and they've used those benchmark examples to show what you could do. How did it work and why did it work? And therefore the advice can be then taken on board. Now think from the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999 up until I think it was around 2020, maybe 2021, when they took out the approved code of practice as part of deregulation. But before, when that code of practice was in place, we used to look at that a lot to then say, there's the benchmark. It's an expected standard. Some would argue now with the management regulations and taking the ACOP away that perhaps it's less specific, but it is part of deregulation. So companies can choose how they are going to interpret it. So once they'd removed that, this has become more and more prominent. So the 2013 version of HHE 65 was Management of Health and Safety as a guidance document, rather than having to hit that quasi-legal standard, of an approved code of practice. There's also the older version of OSAS 18001, and then the newer version of ISO 45001. There are still many companies that have only got accreditation against 18001, and at this point in time, they've chosen not to go down the 45001 route. So it's still in its infancy, 4 years in 2022. So what we're going to see is the removal, perhaps in the next 10 years, of 18001, and then the replacement coming in of 45,001. There's just a few more clauses in it though, but the general Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle still applies. So there we have it, Plan, Do, Check, Act. What it gets you to do is break down each aspect of risk management in order to produce a safety management system that can address those various aspects of risk, but doing it in a cycle approach that allows for, this is the key term, continuous improvement. Okay, so the cycle that's put up in there starts with plan, but it also comes back at the end as part of the reviewing process to then replan. Yeah? So once you've gone through the cycle, it becomes a continuous thing. And that's certainly with some of my customers, that's an area where I find them problematic, because if they've had annual auditing, for example, and they've just got the end of it, they can't, let's relax a bit. I can just chill for a couple of months now before I consider the safety management system and any internal, external audits again. But before they know it, they're on the brink of having the next year's audit, and reaccreditation could be every 2 years. Rarely is it every 3 years, because there is that worry that standards could drop, but there are some independent companies that allow 3-year reviews and reaccreditation. So bear that in mind, it is typically an annual process, and quite a lot of audited companies will come back in on a yearly basis to make sure standards stay as good. And bear in mind what I said before, it's a continuous improvement program, and continuous improvement comes back from total quality management in the early 60s, 70s, more in the 1970s, where it started to grow and have teeth, should we say, a grip on industry, where they then said, oh, let's look for Kaizen, let's look for some of the ways of working that we need to improve upon. And that total quality and continuous improvement philosophy came about with this cycle of Plan, Do, Check, Act. So all we've done in the health, safety and environmental area and the quality area is develop what was in place for total quality management systems, and tweaked it slightly to make it more safety management and environmental management compatible. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is go through each of those areas. In the plan stage, you've got policy and planning as such. Again, go back to what I was saying before. You've got to start with your management review meeting that will outline how far are we going down this path and what's needed to be in place. And within that, you start to grow and develop the safety management system. So you write your policies and your procedures typically, and then you plan to see, as you would with your health and safety policy, who's going to do what, who's responsible for what, and then how we're going to check this and what needs to be in place in terms of documents, resources, as part of the planning process. How often are we going to do our checks? How are we going to generate evidence to show that we've thought about this and we've put it in place in an effective way? So all that preparation, good preparation prevents poor performance. So that's a big thing about planning as such. So spend time to make sure that the safety management system or the integrated management system works for that company. So it starts with the policy as such, and policies are always broken down into 3 parts. The first one is your general statement of intent, and it's up on the wall that everybody says that this is what we're aiming to achieve, and we think we're really good as a company. Thanks very much. But it's the nitty-gritty, and that's the third one. The arrangements is the safety manual. That's the big one that starts to say, well, how are we going to do this? The second one is who's responsible for it. So you could say who's going to do it, and then the third bit is how are they going to do it. So it's great to have a policy statement, because that's your commitment to, and your public commitment, should we say, this is what we need to have in place in order to show, but it's signed by the managing director, and therefore it's showing the senior management commitment. So it's great to have the statement, because it is a statement of intent. It's part of your planning, put your policy in place first, but then the big thing is that health and safety manual or your integrated management system. It digs deep into the arrangements and how we're going to do things. So an effective policy obviously contributes to it, and in order to be effective, it needs to be working well for that particular company. So they will differ slightly. There's always the need to support the human resource development because, again, Kaizen and total quality and continuous improvement, the philosophy of that there is we might not be competent yet, but we'll strive towards competence and we'll keep developing our staff, almost investors in people kind of approach, to make sure that any foreseeable risk is adequately managed because all our staff will work the way we need them to. And again, going back to the last two modules of human factors and also learning from disasters, it's the culture of the organization that needs to develop within the policy. So it needs to start with that commitment from the top and thinking about the way of working. So a big thing is people. And therefore, how can we develop them? How can we change their behaviors, their attitudes? How can we prepare them so they have an understanding of what the quality system is or the safety management system is, ultimately the procedures, the safe systems of work, the ways of working that are going to control risk, having done the risk assessments. Minimizing losses of any kind, obviously. Financial losses are going to drive many companies. Accidents, reducing your accidents from failings and having a better control around your management system is a big part of what the policy should conclude. Think about the culture, and as I was saying before, the human factors, systematically identifying the risks and allocating resources to control them. So within every aspect of what we're doing about manual handling and what we're doing about hazardous substances, you think about it and then you put a structured approach towards it, and then you say, this is how we're going to manage that particular risk. This is how we're going to train people up. This is the resources we need. This is how often we're going to measure it and control the effects of that particular risk. So there needs to be these initiatives so that people think about it. And like I say, it's all derived, this approach, from TQM, Total Quality Management, and that Kaizen and continuous improvement idea. And from that, a way of working. I've thrown this, I apologise about the compass bit on the back. I couldn't change the background as such, but I just wanted to show, for example, if you're putting your policies and procedures in place, you have to think about the different hazards and what may be posed within that company. And in this case, you've probably got the idea of the arrows going around. How do we consider the management of vehicle movement? So in the workplace health safety welfare regs, it would say reduce risk where possible to avoid turning points, and perhaps you can put in place a one-way directional traffic system. So in one of our clients, this is what we've introduced, and it allows us to say from the main entrance coming in through the gates, all traffic outside of the buildings will follow that one-way route, and that way there's less chance of accidents as a result of vehicle movement, because the internal movings, the forklift trucks, etc., will be aware of the one-way system. They'll interact with the vehicles that are delivering to the loading bay, allowing for the one-way system, and thinking about the interaction with pedestrians and the pedestrian routes and so on. So it's just one example, should we say, of how we can look at one risk and then say, are we doing enough? Do we need to do more? How are we going to support this? What are the markings like that are on the floors? Do we need to change that to adapt to, well, what happens if a forklift truck wants to go left, but we're saying they've got to go all around the factory in order to, because it's a one-way system? What impact does that have on our efficiency? Now, the engagement aspect of the people and the teams involved in this can make a difference, substantial difference, because they will then say, and typically this happens in like a cell kind of approach. So different cells, let's say we have a team in the shop blasting area. So the 4 staff that work in the shop blasting area, rather than me come along and say, do it this way, and this system says you've got to do that, get them to come up with that little cell and say, what best works for you? How can we be efficient? And once you've then tried to adapt to how can you be efficient, how can you also be safer? How can you then take account of the environmental impact and the energy sources and the waste that's produced around the job that you do? So think about that and then collectively work on something that can be improved year on year, become more efficient, become safer, become more environmentally friendly. And so it goes on in terms of this longer term approach. So once you've got the badge, it's not really important. A lot of companies just want the badge, but the biggest change and the biggest improvement is that culture. That's, well, when we have a problem, this is the way we sort it out. So a solution-based approach and a practical approach can usually help. So that leads me nicely onto how does it work with the quality system? What is within the quality system that's going to lead us towards this area of compliance? So anyone that's done ISO training will know this, that it starts off with our first point. What are we going to set in place and what are our aims and objectives? Once we've agreed that, the question then comes into how we're going to do it. And when we are saying how we do it, prove it. Prove it, prove it, prove it. So monitoring becomes a big part of it. So if we do achieve a set measurement, or if we do achieve a tolerance from an engineering point of view, we have to then say what is acceptable and what more needs to be done to make it more efficient, better, and progress in the right direction. So maybe the tolerances get tighter and tighter each year, excuse me, because the resources, the capabilities of staff, the learnings from when things have gone wrong with customers have been fed back into the system, and people are better aware of how to organize their work area, how to use their resources, how to think about raw materials and the impact that can have. That is what quality is about, really. So all this learning comes from the 1970s, and it's evolved over the years, taking about the best practice approach. So it changes every 5 to 10 years as to what is considered to be acceptable and best practice. Again, the key thing I would say there is benchmark against industry standards. So you set your standards, put them in place, you monitor and check them and make sure they're complied with. You also look at where can you review and improve upon it when you think that the old standards and the old objectives were okay, but we've learned now, we move forward. Let's change that. Let's get better at what we do. So planning becomes a huge area, because ultimately you're planting your seeds that you want to grow. And those seeds need to grow in the right direction. They need to be watered. They need the right soil. They need enough sunlight in order to make sure that they thrive. So all that planning is very important to make sure you go in the right direction and continue to move forward. The do involves risk profiling, organizing people, and then implementing. How is it going to happen? So from your plan, you're going to say, this is what we're going to do. The doing is actually put it in there, implement it, get on with it, kind of thing. So within this, you'll see those 3 bullet points. Profile your organization's health and safety risks. That's a great starting point. When you've profiled it, you will prioritize, and you'll say, where are we going to spend most time with and put more effort into? The resourcing, the control measures, the budgets. We'll focus on that first, and then we'll grow with it. Organizing for the health and safety. So when you come to the check later, it might require inspections and audits to take place. So as part of that, you've got to build them in with it. So involve, engage, communicate, build a culture, provide adequate resources, include competent advice where needed to make sure that it's benchmarks about industry and legislative standards, so they don't go off on a tangent. So again, thinking about how we're going to organize people, how often they're going to do things, and what's involved in the doing aspect. So then when it comes to implementing it, it's decide, put your protective measures in place, make it happen, provide the right tools and equipment and the people who are trained and instructed on what to do and what's required and what the compliance levels are. And in order to really enforce the acceptable behaviors around competence, so once you've had the training and the instruction, you then need supervisors. And this is a big failing in many companies, is the inadequacies, should we say, the lack of, or the inappropriateness of supportive supervisors. They just miss it quite often. And this comes up time and time again when I'm auditing, is that once you've trained and instructed people, it's then an expectation that they'll do it. Yet one of my clients, he's constantly saying this to me, but he does it to all his staff, is that it can only be managed effectively if it's supervised properly. And that discipline of the supervisor is very, very important. And I say discipline not in terms of when it's gone wrong, is ticking them off and telling them they've done wrong. It's more a case of nip it in the bud before it becomes problematic. And then also when you've thought about your implementation and what's needed in the resources, is to make sure that the resources are provided in a timely manner, so that behaviours from employees and staff when they're implementing this is in fact in line with the procedure. So give them knowledge of the procedure, tell them what's expected. SOPs, standard operating procedures, are a classic example that I use for this. What I like is pictorial versions of standard operating procedures, because it can give you a step-by-step approach, and it will show the pictures of what's done for those practical aspects. And if a person who perhaps not the best in terms of education and learning, and it could be misinterpreted in terms of words that are used, seeing a decent picture paints 1,000 words, they might see this and say, oh, right, I didn't realize that I had to press the green button, the white button, and then the red button. Now that I've seen it in practice in the pictures, I can now follow 1, 2, 3, green, white, red. And as a result of that, it follows the procedure. So again, that supervision means just oversee, watch them. Are they applying the procedure in line with the way we intended it to work? And when they come away from the actual procedure, they don't comply with it, then does it require non-compliance action as a result of that non-compliance? And what will that be? That's where your supervisor needs to have good people skills to be able to modify that behavior and then keep it on track in line with procedures time and time and time again. So you can see now, perhaps going back to the planning, how important it is to do the preparedness bit, get all the resources, the paperwork in place to then support your policies and procedures, but also in the next one, when it comes to checking, how then can you use that to make it happen? Now, a key part, as we mentioned earlier, was risk profiling. So identifying the different areas to the business, but the clauses that are in the ISO standards are in there. And here, this is the link that I was saying about effective supervisors, because you can see there that they've given examples of what that means in this effective risk profile. The leaders, the people at the top, the main managers, and in some cases supervisors, have to make sure that the risks are managed. They have to make sure that everybody's aware of the consequences of non-compliance and what's going to happen in that position. They have a risk assessment approach to it, whereby it's taking account of competent advice. The risk profiling process follows your procedure that's written within your safety management system, and everybody's aware of that and engage with it. And then the checking that's required. And when the check's done, what happens when you get a non-compliance? Who will be responsible for implementing the risk control program and the timescales of it? Again, bear in mind every year, when you're ready for auditing, it gets to that stage where it's reviewed, and then you go back around and round the cycle year on year. And then remembering to assess the effects of changing technology. It's always important on that, because there might be something out there on the market that's now better than what you previously had, and it could be a lot safer by investing in that new piece of technology, and as a result of that, it reduces risks. Now, this is a typical example that I get when it becomes a manual handling risk. Quite often it will say manual handling regulations avoid the need to manual handling, just like it says in the work at height regulations, avoid the need to work at height. And it's your top of your hierarchy for safety management. Don't do it unless you have to. If you have to do it, how are you going to make it safer? So within manual handling, it will say use mechanical handling equipment as an alternative. Quite often, the investment of forklift trucks, for example, can increase risks or to pedestrians and damage to property, but it certainly takes away that manual handling aspect. So whatever you do in the investment of changing technology, it's got to be, again, controlled, new risk assessments done, people trained up and made as safe as any other process within your system. So a consistent approach. managers play a major part on this, because as well as your leaders doing their bit, it kind of devolves down to them to make sure it happens. So your duty holder as the leader, they can't give away that true responsibility. What they can do is delegate it to people to make sure that the process works. So it needs the support from managers to implement it effectively. So identify the risks, who could be affected, control measures, report, record, and review. Very, very similar to the 5 steps to health and safety executives, 5 steps in risk management. So a good process taken from way before the HSE came up with this, and before Plan, Do, Check, Act. So it's a good process, but it used to be problems. Rather than saying identifying risks from a health and safety perspective, it will be identify problems and find solutions to the problems. The old total quality management approach. So that structure was built around and developed into this particular approach. And then from that, people, think about the culture and think about engagement. It's big. Consultation, involvement is written into 3 or 4 different pieces of legislation. So make sure that it happens. And by making it happen, there's so many benefits to that, rather than a manager coming along and say, you will do it my way, or there's the highway. Doesn't work. That aggressive approach doesn't work. Get the people involved. 4 heads are better than 1. So the more you use people, the easier it will be to implement the culture that's acceptance of, well, that's a good idea. Let's do something with that, rather than a blame culture that says, you can't do that, you won't do that, I don't like you doing that. Yeah. So use the appropriate aspect. And then you can't really address competence until you've got everything else in place in the plan and do bit. So when you come to doing it, people need the knowledge, the understanding, the skills, the behaviors, and the attitudes to be able to do it in a competent manner. And that's basically what competence is based on. KSU, A and B. So again, think back to the integrated management system. How much of that is needed to be known, the knowledge aspect? Do they understand it and can they apply it? And if they do apply it, do they show the right behaviors and the right attitudes towards it? Or do you need to go back and give them further training development to make sure that it becomes an implicit way of working? So in the organization section of your policy, it then goes into a lot of detail. So think about the IMS that I've just shown you, and you've got this robust framework in place. People will have the responsibilities, your senior managers, your managers, your line managers, supervisors, and then within that, there you go, aims to develop a positive health and safety culture, the way of working. So an important part of it. And to do that, which again is written in HSG 65 in some detail, it shows the 4 C's. So how are you going to control things that happen in the workplace? Is it sufficient? And how far are you going to go down that route? What cooperation is needed from who? And how much cooperation is needed? So again, thinking of the culture there, it could be engagement with staff and employees. It could be your users, it could be your customers, it could be externals, whereby when they come in, you need that joint approach to engage with them to be able to say, there must be a better way of doing this. We've been bagging these 25 kilogram sacks for years and years, but how about if we process it into a hopper and then we put the hopper on your site and then you just empty the hopper of whatever the substance is inside it to the amount that you need on a regular basis. And therefore it reduces the manual handling, it reduces the amount of dust that's in the air or whatever the fume might be created from it. So again, cooperation and working with stakeholders can help everybody along the road of compliance, but also think about things like REACH, where in the REACH standards, we're trying to reduce the number of nasties out there and twofold, reduce the impact on health, but also reduce the impact on environment by these nasties. Are there better ways? Are there safer ways? Are there other substances that we can ban the use of the nasties? So cooperation can be part of that as a global approach. GHS didn't come about from well, that's a nice nice statement, global harmonization standard. It actually came about because it works. So that cooperation is needed. Communicate, well, that speaks for itself. Biggest problems in most organizations, they will say at least 30% of the time, the factors that caused this particular problem was lack of appropriate communication. So think about the way you communicate it, build that into your organizing and get it out there and market it, and then keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And then C is competence, which I think we've covered sufficiently from an earlier discussion. So again, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but you can see the 4 C's and the questions that we ask around those areas. Under control, you know, who's responsible for it and how they're going to do it, what standard they're going to perform to. Cooperation, you know, promoting cooperation between individuals and the people who need to engage, whether it's safety reps or champions or groups of people that come together for consultation. So think about the consultation regs or the safety reps regulations and the involvement that's expected to comply with that. Encouraging ownership and then making sure they're fully aware of the objectives, not just of the company, but of the small or micromanagement aspects of it. Communicate effectively, get the message across well, make sure they know the policy, procedures and performance, look at behaviours and how managers can actually cause problems, should we say, if they don't follow that route. And then finally, competence, as I was saying before, the knowledge, the skills, the understanding, the attitude, and also the behaviours that all say, yes, we do it properly. Typically, you follow the training needs analysis approach, but the training cycle and the education and development and learning cycle tell us what we need to know in terms of meeting standards, deliver some training that will say then we've covered that gap in the training needs analysis, evaluate how good that training was, and then perhaps change it for the next time that you do it and make it slicker or better, and then apply the skills and the knowledge that's learned from this and observe that to see whether it now meets the standard. And if it doesn't, go back to the training and give them better or more specific training that can cover that gap. So a gap or a training needs analysis is used a lot to show competence of those. And then advice, you know, who you're receiving advice from and is that advice adequate? So the management regulations, regulation 7 says every company must have access to someone who can give that health and safety advice, a competent person. So make sure that advisor gives appropriate advice in line with current standards, legislation, industry standards, benchmarking, and everything else that goes with it. In the implementation, there's a few questions: how we're going to do it, what equipment and resources do we need, and how often we need to maintain them, the instruction and training that's necessary to make people competent enough, and again, coming back to that supervision that's required along the lines to make sure that behaviours are observed and people apply the expected standards. So kind of again thinking about how we're going to implement it, there is the knowledge of the safety management system that's important, but then it's the W's that come out: who, where, what, when, how. When you set your standards, they need to be smart so you can measure them, so specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound, so that when you can come back towards checking that later on, you can say, well, yeah, it is within the standard, or no, it's not. Therefore, we need to either rewrite the standards or we need to improve the way we measure things, that it's more specific and applicable to the way we work. Within that, a separate but similar aspect of safety management systems is the risk control system. So it is about the system, and it looks at the workplace precautions that are in place already, but also how we can then make sure they remain to the right standard. So if you think of the work equipment regulations, provision use of work equipment regulations 1998, it will say provide equipment that is fit for purpose. So there you go, you've got your workplace precautions that are in terms of fit for purpose, it's been provided. But it further then says, once you've provided it, you must maintain it to that standard. So there's a legal requirement, therefore risk control uses that idea a lot. Yeah, if we're going to provide something, it needs to remain fit for purpose. So you think about how it's going to be used, where it's going to be used, and what the problems will be around that. So inputs and outputs are considered in quite detail, but in the middle, it could be the process, you know, that could change the risk profile, could change the level of risk involved in that. So whilst we're operating the machine, the risk to the operator might be adequately controlled with guards in place, and you've not got access to danger zones or electricity or entangled moving parts of the machine. But what happens when you need a maintenance engineer to work on it, where they're removing the guard, or they might choose to have it plugged in, turned on, and the rotating parts are still moving around because they need to do fault diagnosis and testing? Well, what's considered to be adequate, safe, and controlled? And what else do we need to put in place to make sure that the person, whilst they're doing that work, doesn't have an accident? So think about the various aspects of the process and the variations on it. And then finally, the output. You know, once we've done the work, does that then pose problems as well? So where is it going from and to? How are we getting into there? Right, I've got a batch that I've just completed. There's 8 pallets of it, and then I have to get it onto the back of a wagon. And then I've got to organise the transfer note and make sure that goes from one site to another, duty of care and so on. So think about it in all aspects of the process from beginning to end. And then, is it adequately controlled? Is there any legislation we have to think about? Does the procedure cover everything adequately, or is more required? So the plan and do is now covered. Now we're on to a big part. Quality is significantly involved in measuring performance, and then what are we going to do with that? Now, within that measurement of performance or monitoring, you could say there's proactive and reactive, and that is typically how we look at it. So again, there's several of the clauses that focus on this, and certainly from a competency training program in the MVQ level 6 on occupational safety and health, there's a section, well, there's 2 units. One's on proactive and one's on reactive measures. How do we monitor things? And what do we do with that information? And if you think about, let's say football as an example, you are measured on your position within the league, you know, so that's something that's important in terms of the manager and how you perceive the manager. But what about the individual strikers? How are they measured? What about the goalkeeper? How is the goalkeeper measured? It could be that the striker has hit, in the last 5 games, they've scored 3 goals. That might be acceptable in comparison to the benchmark, whereas the goalkeeper might have let in 8 goals in the last 4 games, averaging 2 goals. Is that considered good? Some would say, yeah, it's acceptable because of the opponent's quality and the teams that were playing. Others would say that's not acceptable. There's more improvement needed. So there's a lot of ways you can look at that in terms of the bigger picture and the micromanaged aspects about performance. The important thing is to work out what can be checked, set that standard, and then have the monitoring systems in place that allow you to check that performance. And from checking that performance, what is considered acceptably meeting that compliance and what is not non-compliance. And therefore, from that point, what action will we take? So that's what will lead us down this area of how we're going to do what we're going to do and what's important to us in risk control. So in high risk environments, process-driven, nuclear, in some cases, construction projects, you cannot afford to get it wrong. It's got to be spot on. Therefore, there'll be more time and resources put into that to say error is not an option. Therefore, we've got to make sure that the competence of the staff, the resources that are provided, the way that we manage this is top notch. Yeah, so there's that aspect as to how you're going to go down that route. How effective are policies? How effective are procedures? What are we going to use as our benchmark at the moment? We have little accidents? Do we report near misses? Do we need to report it? Are we going to report near misses? If we do measure that, what is good to us and how are we going to use that information? Are we going to set up campaigns to make improvements? Once we determine what that is, how then can we continuous improvement when we've been doing 3, 4 or 5 years working on this ISO standard? Should the monitoring against predetermined standards be in place? Well, yes, of course it is. It's got to be done, but what will that be? And to what extent, again, will differ on every company. The key idea is we need this in order to maintain and improve. You know, it's a measure that tells us where we are now, where we want to be, how we're going to get there. Where are we deficient? How good are we at doing this? Is there anything more that we need to learn from? So there's 2 ways typically we look at: active and reactive. So let's look at them both. In the active monitoring, we're looking at information that tells us how we're doing now before accidents take place. So inspections of premises, housekeeping checks, inspections on plant and equipment, health surveillance. People are not reporting ill health, or in fact, there's a performance measure that's going in the right direction. Observations and information that comes back from supervisors saying, yes, the attitudes and behaviours of staff when they're performing those tasks appears to be good. Health and safety performance reports. You might do sampling where you're going to say, right, today we're going to go out there and look at manual handling. Tomorrow we're going to look at hazardous substances and so on. And as a result of those surveys, performance reports are put together and it says we can do better in certain areas. And you have a group, rather than one person do it, you have a group of people from different backgrounds that have different ways of looking at those particular issues, a fresh pair of eyes, for example. And they might say, well, why do you do it that way? Is there not a better way of doing things like that? Continuous improvement. Safety representatives definitely needed, and consultation with them. You know, if you look at the regs and the consultation regs, there's a big aspect as to why we do that. There's so many benefits of consultation because you can get that collective idea of better standards. So within your health and safety committee meetings, for example, you might have to have a section whereby your safety representatives have a chat about some of the key things that have happened in the last few weeks, but also they've been involved in the inspections, they've been involved in writing the risk assessments and looking at the expected control measures. So when they do the inspections, they can say people are behaving and they've got the right attitude because the resources are there, they follow the procedure and it's evident. Or they might say, well, the fire extinguisher has not been checked. It was used 3 weeks ago and nobody's replaced it. Therefore, that information is also important that's brought up at safety committee meetings and actions can be addressed by management. So there's all that aspect that ultimately we're working towards a better performance and better standards in the workplace. But also the competence aspect comes up again and you have the opportunity to say, are we doing a good enough job or do we need more training? In the reactive side, so it's happened, we're using historical evidence to be able to prove that things are on target or have not quite gone to plan. So how many injuries and accidents do you have? How many ill health conditions have been reported? Has there been any other losses, property damage and equipment damage and so on, that's now saying things that aren't as good as they could be? And near misses, do you involve people in reporting that, and what's the benefits of reporting near miss? So historical evidence that gives opportunity to then say, how are we doing and where can we do better? So using an example I've just done with one company, they've got 8 accidents in the last 4 months. So 2 months on average, 2 a month on average of eye injuries. Therefore, they're now considering, and I know it should be PPE as a last resort, but they're now considering putting glasses, safety glasses on all the time as you walk into the workplace. And therefore it will reduce the potential. Now, that might work, but it comes with it certain problems because safety glasses aren't comfortable. They don't always offer the protection that's needed in the variation on a theme. It causes sweat. It fogs up and you can't see where you're going and what you're doing. Sometimes safety glasses have this kind of like at the bottom section, when you look down, it magnifies it because of your position of your eyes. And so when you rely on PPE, there's reasons why it's the bottom of the hierarchy, because it doesn't always work. So there could be a better way. In some of the processes, can we put or improve the guards that are on some of the equipment? Can we change the way maybe it's dust that's getting into people's eyes because it's allowed to accumulate in the air? Can it be done differently, better, more efficiently? It's going to reduce the potential. So look at it from a different angle. So as the competent person giving advice, say, rather than just saying that everybody should wear safety glasses, come back a little bit, look a bit deeper into it, do a root cause analysis, and then determine the most appropriate means and action and control measures. When we investigate, it doesn't have to be incidents or just accidents. There's a particular method that we use. And again, in the quality management system, you'll write a policy and procedure that typically has these areas in. So root cause analysis is a great one. Some companies don't want to go down that depth, and they just say, well, we'll identify causes on a basic level. What are we going to do to prevent it from happening again? Because if the health and safety executive come in as a result of radio, that's the first question they're going to say. So you put some mitigating circumstances in place to reduce risk, but prove to me that you're going to prevent it from happening again. And they'll use that and record it. So you have to consider that as part of your investigation. And for me, it's one of the biggest areas that I spend a lot of time on when I do an investigation. A timely approach to when you do the incident investigation is important, because the longer it goes on, the more a human and the brain will make it interesting. You know, it's not accurate. So as time goes by, you've told the story 3, 4, 5, 10 times. My mum is great at this. Oh, and the 10th time she's told the story is very, very different to the first time. And that's just because she gets bored. So she gets bored in describing it. So a timely approach to investigation is needed, so you can get all the facts when they're fresh. And I'm not saying stand over the injured body whilst they're waiting to go to the accident and emergency in a semi-conscious state. You say, come on, Bob, tell us what happened. Give us all the information. I'm going to write a statement. And I know you've got blood on your hands. Can you just sign the bottom of the statement there? Yeah. Make it right, but think about the timeliness of it. As time goes by, it's going to be less accurate. You need factual information, therefore evidence needs to be gathered, and where possible, come together with some kind of interpretation of the underlying causes. Once you've identified those underlying causes, then focus on what can we do to prevent that incident from happening again. So that's the check aspect, with a little bit of discussion around accident investigation techniques. Then the final stage is ACT. So within ACT, it says, what can we learn from the way we've been working? How can we continuously improve? So once you've had information that's come back to you from your measuring and monitoring these procedures, what are you going to do with it? Is it either good enough as it is because we're having a really good year and there's been very little incidents, accidents, or non-conformances, or is it the other side of it where it's showing that we are doing badly and we need to learn, we need to change, we need to improve? So review, close the loop, find out how we can do things better, and continuously improve. So higher control measures going to still apply year on year. You could say things age, things deteriorate. If it's a metal guard that's in a moist environment, damp environment, a salty environment, it could corrode. That's just one example of deterioration, but there could be other things, whether it's your control procedure, whether it's technology that's changed, whether you've put a safety switch. Let's say Buncefield is an example where they've had a switch there that's supposed to tell them that it's getting close to full, and it's supposed to make a safety stop so it can't be overflowed, but something went wrong. Why did it go wrong? So can it deteriorate? Yes, they can. What's the life shelf of it? How effective will it be? What maintenance is needed to bring it back to an acceptable standard? Review that provides information to managers on the adequacy of the current arrangements. So look at what you've got in place. And within that, think about your information that's needed that proves that you're compliant, or make judgments as well that say, I think it's okay for now, but we need to think about budgets for the next 12, 16, 18 months that are going to help us to prepare for when it does fail. And it will fail at some point, so we need to make sure we collectively look at that. Hence, if you use fixed electrical wiring as an example, it's tested every 5 years to make sure that the wiring remains fit for purpose. So within your review, you can say, oh, we're coming up towards the end of the year 4. Next year, we'll budget for another 5-year fixed wiring assessment, and we'll put replacements in line with the changes that are necessary coming from that report from an independent expert. So again, think about the aspects of where it can go wrong and what can happen when it doesn't quite meet the standards. In your review, you need to get the information. You need the information to be as accurate as it possibly can. So rather than just being one person's view, it needs to be credible. And within that credible aspect, you need to talk to people, interview them on the way they work. You need to look at documents. So this becomes part of your auditing procedure to make sure that documents follow and are in line with the procedures. And also from the attitudes and behaviors, you need to observe people acting in a particular way. So that approach takes account of how we will pull a report together, whether it's the audit, typically, the internal audit, and also the external auditor that will do your 2-yearly or annual review, that will then put together a report to say you're either fully compliant, you've got a few areas that you could do better in, so I'm going to put a recommendation in for improvement, or you've got a non-compliance which shows in several areas, and they put an action plan together to say sort it out very quickly, otherwise you're going to lose accreditation. The same thing applies in any form of report and review, to be able to give a management team an action plan, and also to make sure that it's not just one person's view, it's a credible document taking account of a variety of different sources to make it authentic. So current legislation, learnings from previous incidents, what's happening in the industry, and so on and so forth. So make sure that it takes account when you're making those judgments. Evidence that's relevant to standards, benchmarks, anything in the legal register, and also changes in legislation, the guidance that's surrounding the industry standard to benchmark against it, and also try to avoid the blame culture, because when you do have an incident and you need to review it, and rather that someone was honest and told us why it went wrong, rather than saying, oh well, we've got this blame culture at work, so if I said anything, they're gonna sack me anyway. So you've got to avoid that blame culture approach as well. So you can see then that it's either working or it's not. So when you do your review of your safety management system, you take account of everything that's been measured. You use those findings to then tell you whether you're still compliant. You then review as to whether there's any new legislation or better ways of doing things. And you will de-layer the structural changes that might be in place, because that's considered to be best practice at the moment in terms of management and functionality. So can you be flatter in your structure, de-layer it so it's not becoming a power bank whereby every decision has to be made from someone at the top, so a bit more autonomy in the organization. And then regular reviews and the intervals that need to be set around that. So it's continuous improvement. We need to think about, are we performing to the required standard, and where we've gone wrong, what we can do to make improvements. So accidents, investigations, vulnerabilities, risk register, the non-compliances, where can we improve? So that helps to close the loop. Plan, do, check, act. Within that, the variation is, and it's only a slight variation, but the 45,001 that came out 4 years ago, it had a little bit more around the specifics. And it's now divided the various clauses. The biggest part is clause 4. And within clause 4, it asks the requirement of plan, do, check, act. But in the center of it, it says leadership and worker participation. because they're now splitting it into areas where they're saying that the culture is necessary in order to make it successful. So in order to do that, it needs that managers, leaders to be involved heavily in the quality management system. And in terms of ISO 45001, in terms of health and safety, in order to prevent accidents and incidents and to make sure it works effectively, there needs that engagement with workers, that participation, and the relationship with leaders and leadership to make sure that it's part of life. So classic example that I get quite often is a manager's popping down onto the shop floor. They're not wearing their safety shoes. They're not wearing their ear protection or their eye protection. So when they come on and they have reasons for it, they'll say, I'm only here for a few minutes. Don't worry, I'm not going to suffer from noise exposure or anything like that. I'm not going to need a forklift truck, so I don't need safety. It's all that, well, you're making us do this and we're exposed to these hazards all the time, but you don't believe in it. So that leadership and worker participation is a big part. Set your standard. Everybody's seen to meet the standard, and there's that philosophy, there's that culture, there's that feeling of engagement throughout. So the Plan, Do, Check Act in ISO 45001 is more or less the same. It's just been tweaked ever so slightly and a bit more focus on questioning. Questioning your objectives, questioning how you do it, the way your process works, and making sure that you're monitoring, particularly in the check section, is adequate to then come back to, well, we've set these objectives, have we achieved the objectives? And the audits that report the results, the internal audits, the system needs to be in place to make sure that it works, and that behavior and attitudes that needs to be seen as part of the competence program. So a few years ago, a report was done on quality, and from that they decided on the top 10, you could say, of reasons how quality systems can be seen to be effective and successful. So as you can see, as we've just mentioned, leadership, commitment, responsibility and accountability from the top. Again, the top are promoting the culture that supports the intended outcomes of the management system. Communication is good. Consultation and participation is evident, and it's part of the way they work. The necessary resources are not just provided, but they're also maintained. The policies are compliant with most, and people can, when we say compatible there, they're more likely to achieve them. Yeah, so not putting unachievable standards in there within the policies and the procedures. Effective processes, they're in place for the risk management aspect, continual performance evaluation. So your check bit does the job to be able to give us information that's useful. The management system is integrated into the business process. So decisions, when they're made, they think about and they act upon health and safety rather than just thinking of it as an afterthought. And the objectives align with the way that you do things at work and your risk profiling. So just to finish off, as we've mentioned earlier, 3 key documents, I guess, are, I said 3 there, but ISO 18001, the old version, or 45001 as such, so if we just look at health and safety. The other thing is, if quality aspect is big in terms of environment and environmental impact, then there's also 14001 as well. If you don't go down the route of having a safety management system that has to comply with ISO accreditation, well, the standard that you have to achieve, which will be questioned in court when things go wrong, will be HSG 65, because that's the ACOP, the management regs ACOP's gone now. So they're only using the guidance document, Health and Safety Guidance 65, Health and Safety Management. So it's the legislation being interpreted as a guidance document, and then companies have to apply the best fit that suits their organisation, their culture, their way of working. Okay, that's me done. Thank you for your time. And that's the last input, should we say, as part of the Risk Management Unit 3. Thank you.